Good evening, it's Thomas the Hermit, and I am glad to be here. Hello, Indiana, Fugue, Sword, John Causis, and we are going to be talking on this Utopiana about the theology of John of the Cross. Now, a lot of things go into my mind when I'm thinking about John of the Cross. This cannot be a comprehensive thing on John of the Cross because his theology is extremely extensive. Okay? I read John of the Cross about, 35, 40 years ago. And I would have to say that I've gone through a period of not reading him, although I had read him much in my early years of sinking contemplation. Now, one of the things that I have found is very difficult for people. I found this out when we were first starting the Humble Holy Laity, the Facebook group. And I mentioned to everyone that they were too attached to themselves. And throughout the short history of our group, I've had various confrontations with people over their various attachments. When one reads even the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Ascent of Mount Carmel is the Ascent of Mount Carmel introduces the idea of the dark night, and the book that follows that is The Dark Night of the Soul. Now, the dark night of the soul is, as I've been trying to explain over a long period of time now, the dark night of the soul is a particular spiritual state that happens to the very few. Now, those are not my words; those are the words of John of the Cross. Okay. And the dark night of the soul is an impenetrating of God's light that is so intense that it basically, the experience of the person is that God has abandoned them. Now that's where the complexity of understanding what John means by dark nights kind of comes in. He explains that in the Ascent to Mount Carmel. Now, right now, Chris is, if you're wondering where Chris is on a retreat. But it is good that Chris is on a retreat because Chris really doesn't know about the theology of John of the Cross. Now, I am not an expert in the theology of John of the Cross. Okay? I have some experience, and I have read his works and read them and reread them. But I'm in no ways would be considered anywhere near an expert on his writings. But what we're going to talk about is this sense of detachment. And when we think of detachment, we're thinking in, Western materialistic terms. Now, John of the Cross did not grow up in the 20th century, and he certainly did not grow up in Western materialism. He grew up in Spain, and we know in the 15th century, except for the extremely wealthy aristocracy, most people didn't have very much. But even then, John of the Cross was teaching about detachment from the material world. Now, I don't know where that places us. You know, I'm going to give you a taste. I'm going to give you a little taste of John of the Cross, and I want your reaction to this. You're going to find these words quite extraordinary. This is right out of the ascent of Mount Carmel. Actually, it's not in the ascent, but it's in a sketch that he made where he sketched a sketch of ascending Mount Carmel, and here's what he had to say. Pick up on each of these words, and then you tell me about John of the Cross. To reach satisfaction in all, desire its possession in nothing. To come to the knowledge of all, desire the knowledge of nothing. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To arrive at being all, desire to be nothing. Okay, so there I have shared with you a small saying of John of the Cross. I'm going to repeat it to you again, because you're probably scratching your ears going, did he really say that? Listen to what he said. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To arrive at being all, desire to be nothing. To reach satisfaction in all, desire its possession in nothing. To come to the knowledge of all, desire the knowledge of nothing. Okay, I accept that I accept what you're saying, John Causis in Indiana. Okay, and that's kind of one of my points, all right? Like I said, I have been reading this stuff for a long time. And I'm beginning to understand that when I first read The Ascent of Mount Carmel, I said, whoa, you know, and part of me, you know, was like, hey, I think John of the Cross is cool, you know, he has a really cool name, you know, John of the Cross, in Spanish, Juan de la Cruz. And he's called the mystical doctor. And I would have to say that in most of my life, I've been kind of drawn towards that kind of a desert experience. Now that I'm reading him again, some 30 years later, what comes to my mind is that I applied some of what he said in his writings because that's all I could handle at that time. His words were so foreign, his concepts so far away from the reality of my life and the reality of who I was. Let's look at another part of his writing. Okay. In order that we may the better prove what has been said, it must be known that the affection and attachment which the soul has for creatures renders the soul like to these creatures, and the greater is its affection, the closer is the equality and likeness between them. For love creates a likeness between that which loves and that which is loved. I'm going to give you a little paraphrase and then I'm going to repeat it again. What he's saying is the attachment to created things will make you like the thing that you are attached to. Okay? Let me read it again. In order that we may better prove what has been said, it must be known that the affection and attachment which the soul has for creatures renders the soul like to these creatures, and the greater is its affection, the closer is the equality and likeness between them. For love creates a likeness between that which loves and that which is loved. Now, when we're speaking in such terms, okay, we see two things happening. One is that John is speaking from the Greek philosophical thoughts. All right, if you recall, Thomas Aquinas integrated Greek thought into the Catholic Church through the Summa Theologica, that great work that has guided the Catholic Church for some 500 years. Okay? But having said that, we can see that he's talking in the old philosophical bent. He's saying that that which you love, you become. Now, how does that apply to contemplation? Well, it applies like this. If you are attached to the things that God has created, then you become like them. But if you are attached to God, you become like God. Now, I'm not saying you become God. That would be a great heresy. But the Christian journey is to become an alter Christos, another Christ. So John, in the ascent of Mount Carmel, in a nutshell, is saying attachment to the world is contrary to you being attached to God. Attachment to the world is contrary to being attached to the world. Okay? Now I have other things to go ahead and share with you from the ascent of Mount Carmel. All right, this is actually a pretty good quote. Okay. For which reason, David, speaking of those who set their affection upon idols, said thus: Simus illis fiant qui faciunt ea, et omnes qui confidon in eis, which signifies, let them that set their hearts upon them be like them. And thus he that loves a creature becomes as low as that creature, and in some ways lower. For love not only makes the lover equal to the object of his love, but even subjects him to it. Hence, in the same way, it comes to pass that the soul that loves anything else becomes incapable of pure union with God and transformation in him. For the low estate of the creature is much less capable of union with the high estate of the Creator than is darkness with light. For all things of earth and heaven compared with God are nothing. As Jeremiah says in these words, Expecit terram et ecce vacua erat et nihil et coelos, et non erat lux in eis. I beheld the earth, he says, and it was void, and it was nothing, and the heavens, and saw that they had no light. In saying that he beheld the earth void, he means that all its creatures were nothing, and that the earth was nothing likewise. And in saying that he beheld the heavens, and saw no light in them, he says that all the luminaries of heaven compared with God are pure darkness, so that in this way all the creatures are nothing, and their affection, we may say, are less than nothing, since they are an impediment to transformation in God and the privation thereof, even as darkness is not only nothing, but less than nothing, since it is privation of light. And even as he that is in darkness comprehends not the light, so the soul that sets its affection upon creatures will be unable to comprehend God, and until it be purged, it will neither be able to possess him here below through pure transformation of love, nor yonder in clear vision. And for greater clarity, we will now speak in greater detail. Okay, so there we hear a more definitive statement by John. Okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about the writing style of John of the Cross. All right? You will find in the writing style of John of the Cross something that will definitely put you to sleep. He takes a concept and then he breaks it down. Okay? John Causis might like his style. John, I think, is he told me one time that he was a researcher. Well, in a sense, John kind of writes like a researcher. And he makes a statement, and then he breaks it down, and then he breaks it down further, and he dissects it and cuts it. And I remember reading The Ascent to Mount Carmel many years ago, and I remember by degree and by degree, he takes you deeper and deeper into what it means to be detached from the world. You know, it's really uncanny, you know, and you know, I think most people are going to shy away from this. You know, number one, we're scratching our head and saying, really? You know, we have to really escape away from the good things of the world so we can be attached to God. You know, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to go, well, that's not for me. You know, and in my sense, I'm not saying, you know, I mean, I had some leanings towards the desert when I was younger, and I had romantic ideas about the mystics, the desert fathers, you know, the hermits, you know, and of course Saint Francis of Assisi. You know Saint Francis of Assisi, you know, embraced poverty, for instance. And then you know, in the 70s in the church, and probably before that, starting in the 60s, probably post-Vatican II, was really going away from that kind of a spirituality. And I also think that if we talk about Spanish culture, you know, Spanish culture is complex, to say the least. You know, Spanish culture does embrace these ideas of detachment and desert and darkness, but at the same time, Spanish culture embraces passion. And I find it very interesting because John of the Cross, who says, you know, about being detached from the world and all of this, you know, also says, also writes great poetry. You know, he also makes sketches. All right, the sketch. Let me see. That's the left of me. The sketch on the left that you see that I have displayed is actually a sketch by John of the Cross. And if you know anything about the sketch that John of the Cross made of the crucified Christ, you will know that this particular sketch was used by Salvador Dali. When Salvador Dali started to make several paintings about the crucifixion. And I think one of them is titled, The Crucifixion by John of the Cross. Also, we know that John was a great poet. Now, I'm not fluent in Spanish, all right? But scholars have said that the Spanish poetry of John of the Cross is of the highest caliber, okay? Now, I do have an English translation here. Let me look that up for you. I found one that I like. This is it. No, hold on. Okay. Maybe it's in here. Let me look. Okay, I can't find it, so I'm going to go ahead, because I pulled up several things, I'm going to go ahead and read to you the poem that is titled The Dark Night. Now, why is the poem important for the ascent to Mount Carmel? All right, the works, both The Dark Night of the Soul and The Ascent of Mount Carmel, are based on this poem. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to read the poem by John of the Cross, The Dark Night. Once in the dark night, when love burned bright with yearning, I arose, O windfall of delight, and how I left none knows, dead to the world my house in deep repose. In the dark where all goes right, thanks to a secret ladder, other close, O windfall of delight, in the dark enwrapped in those dead to the world, my house in deep repose. There in the lucky dark, none to observe me, darkness far and wide, no sign for me to mark, no other light, no guide, except for my heart, the fire inside, that led me true as the very noon is, truer too to where there waited one, I knew how well I knew, in a place where no one was in view. O dark night, my guide, night dearest than anything all your dawns discover, O night drawing side to side, the loved and the lover, she that the lover loves lost in the lover. Upon my flowering breast, kept for his pleasure garden, his alone, the lover was sunk in rest. I cherished him my own. There in air from my plumes of the cedar blown, in air from the castle walls, as my hand in his hair moved lovingly at play, he let cool fingers fall in the fire there where they lay. All sense in oblivion drift away. I stayed not minding me, my forehead on the lever, I reclined. Earth ending, I went free, left all my cares behind, among the lilies falling and out of mind. So we actually have an artist in this theologian. He's a poet. He created a sketch of Mount Carmel as well as the sketches you see here. And he is Spanish. He has passion. Towards the end of The Dark Night of the Soul, he talks about the recollection of joy, the recollection of the passion of joy towards God alone, a purification, if you will, that joy has been liberated and set completely free from its attachment to the world to the self and to even the effects of God, which I've kind of talked a little bit about in the past, that even we will be purified from our attachment to the sweet things of God until in joy only God is our only joy. So even though he talks about this strenuous ascent of Mount Carmel, we find that in the end our passions become passionate for God alone. And I think that's very interesting, and I think we need to understand that in the light of John of the Cross. Okay? Let me look at some of your comments. Yes, Salvador Dali was inspired by the sketch of John of the Cross. Also, if you recall, Salvador Dali did other religious Catholic themes. Okay, I like this comment by Charles Walsh. St. Paul says, I'm crucified to the world. It is not I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. All right, so we're getting this when we start to read the ascent of Mount Carmel, and he dissects and brings about and reveals all the problems with being attached to the world and how they are an impediment in helping us to draw the closest to the Lord. Pat C, very interesting. I've been thinking about you, Pat C. I kind of miss you at our prayer times when you come in and you say, hello, family. I kind of miss that. Please try to join us in prayer at times, but I'm glad to see you here. Charles Walsh, yes, the Song of Songs. John of the Cross, did write not a parody, but an inspired work off the Song of Songs called the Spiritual Canticle. And in the Spiritual Canticle, you can see, within the Spiritual Canticle, you can see a more positive side of John of the Cross. I think we need to be careful when we are looking at the ascent to Mount Carmel not to get too weighted down. Now we have to understand where he came from and where we are at, okay? And although it would benefit us greatly to embrace the teachings of John of the Cross, exactly how much can our defiled flesh even respond to it, okay? I saw a video recently by Father Mark Goring where he mentions that we are all tainted. Now, he didn't get that from himself. He got it from the writings of Our Lady of Argentina. And it is true. We are all living in a big cesspool of materialism. And we are attached, very much so, to this world. All right? So the writings of the ascent to Mount Carmel, which is not as severe as the dark night of the soul. But what is the importance of the writings of the ascent to Mount Carmel? Well, Jesus was the same yesterday, today, and forever. And just because we have grown materialistic as all get out of Kansas you can get, because we're extremely caught up in a sewer, a cultural sewer, doesn't mean that God's approach has changed. And the dark nights are not by your choosing. The dark nights are something that God brings into people's lives. The dark nights are brought into your life. When you are going through a dark night, and it'd usually be the first one, the dark night of the senses, it is because God chooses to bring you through that. Now this is where it kind of gets interesting. In the ascent to Mount Carmel, in the prologue, let me look at that real quick. I'm going to look at the prologue, which he wrote. Okay, the prologue was not written by someone else. He talks about why he is writing this. Okay? You'll have to be patient with me. I'm trying to scroll through the pages of a book. All right, I have found the prologue. All right. Now, here's what John says in the prologue. This is what he wrote. And this is the beginning of the book, The Ascent of Mount Carmel. In order to expound and describe this dark night through which the soul passes in order to attain to the divine light of the perfect union of the love of God, as far as possible in this life, it would be necessary to have illumination of knowledge and experience other and far greater than mine. Okay? For this darkness and these trials, both spiritual and temporal, through which happy souls are wont to pass in order to be able to attain this highest state of perfection, are so numerous and so profound that neither does human knowledge suffice for the understanding of them, nor experience for the description of them. For only he that passes this way can understand it, and even he cannot describe it. Okay, so he starts off by saying that he's trying to write so that people will understand what these spiritual dark nights are all about. Okay, and he goes on to say more about this, and he says some very interesting things. I'm going to try to glean some of these ideas. Okay, here we go. On the fourth section of the prologue, he says this: wherefore, to the end that all, whether beginners or proficients, may know how to commit themselves to God's guidance, when His Majesty desires to lead them onward, we shall give instruction and counsel by His help, so that we may be able to understand His will, or at the least allow Him to lead them. All right, now here comes a problem. For some confessors and spiritual fathers, having no light and experience concerning these roads, or want to hinder and harm such souls rather than to help them on the road. They are like the builders of Babel, who when told to furnish suitable material, gave and applied other very different materials, because they understood not the language, and thus nothing was done. Wherefore it is a difficult and troublesome thing at such seasons for a soul not to understand itself, or to find none who understands it. For it will come to pass that God will lead the soul by a most lofty path of dark contemplation and aridity, wherein it seems to be lost, and being thus full of darkness and trials, constraints and temptations, will meet one who will speak to it like Job's comforters, and say that it is suffering from melancholia or low spirits or a morbid disposition, or that it may have some hidden sin, and that it is for this reason that God has forsaken it. Such comforters are wont to declare immediately that the soul must have been very evil, since such things as these are befalling it. Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that the Lord will draw a person through a dark night, and that the person's counselors or spiritual directors will either tell them that they are depressed, that's melancholia, or that they are, full of evil, that they're sinful, and that's why they're going through all of these problems. Could you imagine that you're going through these difficulties and your counselor says to you, you know what, let me give you some drugs for your depression, okay? Or a person, a priest in confession says, you know what, you must have done something really, really bad. So why don't you go back and think about all the bad things and come and give me a real confession. But see, the dark night is not about depression, and it is not about sin. It is about God's action within the soul to purify it and raise it to a better level. In fact, in the ascent of Mount Carmel, John goes on to say that at some point the soul becomes aware that this attachment to the world, that they will never be free from it unless God Himself does something about it. Now that's the key. That's the key. The dark night is God taking the soul into a place of purification so that they will become detached from the world. And John talks about, let me see if I can get this right, he talks about 3 darknesses. One is the darkness that is created through attachment to the world. The second darkness the first one is being purified from the detachment of the world, and that is darkness to the senses. Okay, I'll talk about that in a minute. The second one is the darkness of faith. The second night in the dark night of the senses is the darkness of faith. And let me think. I remember the third one. The third darkness. Oh yeah, the third darkness is the darkness that is created by God. Okay, and what? Okay, the first darkness is the purification of your attachment to your senses. Okay, the senses are how you understand the world. Okay, now remember what I said about Greek thought and Greek philosophy and Catholic theology, how they merged. Okay, so in Greek philosophy, they talk a lot about the senses and how the senses perceive the world. So what you smell, what you taste, what you feel, what you see, what you hear. All right? And that all of your senses are attached. You know, we're attached to that particular flavor of ice cream. We're attached to that beauty that we see. When you ever see someone who says, that's an eyesore, I never understood that because I was never attached to beauty per se. But some people are so attached to beauty that whenever they don't see beauty, it disturbs them. Okay? There are people who are attached to the touch of soft things. Others who are attached to sound, right? They have to have certain music all the time. Of course, I'm kind of paraphrasing as best I can, but the fact is that the senses connect us to the world And the attachment to the world comes through our senses. John of the Cross goes through extensively in the Ascent to Mount Carmel and talks about how the dark night purifies you from the different attachments to the senses, and why the senses that are impure, because we are attached to them, why they need to be purified, and how the dark night of the senses purifies us from attachment to the world. The first, it is darkness to the senses to say, you know what? All right, this is the way you see, experience the world, feel, taste, and hear the world. But you know what? That's not important. That's the first darkness. The second darkness is to walk by faith alone. I've covered this before many, many times. Okay? It is my experience that I grow the most in faith when everything is going wrong. Now, why would I say something terrible like that? Because one of the aspects of the dark night of the senses is that whatever you're trying to do in the world seems to keep failing. I went through years of it. It didn't matter what I did. There was nothing but failure after failure after. It didn't matter what I did. Okay? It was destined to fail. I'm not going to say that God's going to do that to everyone. I'm saying He did it to me. But I proceeded to continue to have faith in God. So the second darkness, which John of the Cross calls the deep darkness of midnight, when it's darkest at the middle of the night. Okay? The third darkness that John says is in the dark night of the senses is the darkness created by God. Now, I've talked about this before in the past. Teresa of Avila also talks about it. All right? That when God is present, it is darkness to us. A passage of scripture that I really like is, my ways are above your ways as far as the heavens are from the earth. My ways are above your ways as far as the heavens are above the earth. Of course, we have this idea in our central, solo, self perspective. We have all sorts of crazy ideas. One is that other people think like you do. That's one, deceit that we have. And further along that line, we have the idea that God thinks like we do. How absurd. Now, do I think that God thinks like I do? Yeah, I do. Philosophically, do I think that God thinks like I do? No, I don't. All right? When you are in God's presence itself, you will be overawed by how different His thoughts are from your thoughts, and that will plunge the mind into darkness. Let's look at some other things that John has said in the dark night. The ascent to Mount Carmel. We're not doing the dark night of the soul. Okay? I'm just going to read these because I collected them as I was making notes today, and I will read them and then we'll talk about it. All the wisdom of the world and all human ability compared with the infinite wisdom of God are pure and supreme ignorance. Even as St. Paul writes, saying, Sapientia huas mundi stultitia est apud Deum. Okay? The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. Wherefore, any soul that makes account of all its knowledge and ability in order to come to union with the wisdom of God is supremely ignorant in the eyes of God, and will remain far removed from that. Wisdom, for ignorance knows not what wisdom is, even as St. Paul says that this wisdom seems foolishness to God, since in the eyes of God, those who consider themselves to be persons with a certain amount of knowledge are very ignorant. So that the apostles writing to the Romans says of them, Decentes inum si esse sapientes stulti facti sunt. That is, professing themselves to be wise, they became foolish. And those alone acquire wisdom of God, who were like ignorant children, and laying aside their knowledge, walk in his service with love. This manner of wisdom St. Paul taught likewise in Corinthians, si quis videtur inter vos sapiens esse in hoc soeculo stultus fiat ut, sed sapiens sapientia inam huas mundi stultitia est apud Deum. That is, if any man among you seems to be wise, let him become ignorant, that he may be wise, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. So that in order to come to union with the wisdom of God, the soul has to proceed rather by unknowing than by knowing. And all the dominion and liberty of the world compared with the liberty and dominion of the Spirit of God is the most abject slavery, affliction, and captivity. This signifies, he shall turn to the right hand and shall be hungry, and he shall eat. On the left hand and shall not be filled. For they that mortify not their desires, when they turn justly, see the fullness of the sweetness of spirit of those who are at the right hand of God. I'm a little bit ahead of myself. Let's just hold on for a minute. Okay, so I just read another quote of John of the Cross, where he's talking about why it is necessary that we humble our intellect, okay, in the face of God's presence. Like I told you a minute ago, my ways are above your ways, as high as the heavens are above the earth, okay? That is, and then he talks about unknowing. Now, unknowing is a term, John of the Cross, now you have to understand, John of the Cross, although the idea of the dark night is principally his theology, not everything in his theology comes from John of the Cross. The idea of unknowing precedes John of the Cross in the writings of other great saints. All right? But this aspect of walking in faith and not by what you think, not by what you think. And like I said, when you're in the presence of God, you're like, duh. You know, all of a sudden, you know, you're like, duh, I don't know. Because God's wisdom and knowledge is so far beyond our understanding. Now, I'm going to just say something about that for a minute, because this is something that can be helpful for those of you who are trying to learn how to do contemplative prayer, which is this, okay? Not relying upon your own understanding is an effect of allowing the presence of God to dominate your mind. Let me say that again. Letting the presence of God dominate your mind is an important factor in contemplative prayer. Now, I've been trying to say this for a while, and this is something that is missing from the church right now. Okay, what is missing from the church right now? What is missing from the church right now is not the value of the intellectual discourse, the theological searching of truth, the philosophical searching of truth. All of that is within our church. What is missing is the integration of contemplation as a part of the pursuit of truth. Because it's not always so important what my intellect comes up with, but what my intellect comes up with in union with God. That's why in the great doctors of the church, a lot of them were great mystics, so that the fusion of their thoughts with the divine thoughts produced such great works and sound theological works, because they had combined their understanding with God's understanding. Okay? So in doing so, they were able to create great things like the Summa Theologica. Okay? Now the Summa Theologica, like I said, was such a great work that Thomas Aquinas created that it has guided the church for almost 500 years. He created it somewhere around the 12th century. I don't have exact dates for that. Okay? Now, John of the Cross is not really talking in those terms. Now, I did find something interesting about John of the Cross. You might find interesting. He was educated by the Jesuits, but not necessarily in theology. He was educated by the Jesuits in the humanitarians. Now, why do I say that? Because the Jesuits, as taught by St. Ignatius, all right, did exactly what I'm saying. They brought God presence into their understanding. Okay, and I find that interesting because then we have this guy, you know, and he comes up with this great work, The Ascent of Mount Carmel and The Dark Night of the Soul, which is his masterpiece. The Dark Night of the Soul, John of the Cross's masterpiece. But he comes up with these things, and they're imbued with a great intellectuality. So we have this funny term, mystical doctor. And it's a funny term because a lot of the hermits and holy men and women of the past were not intellectuals. They lived in the cloud of unknowing. They allowed themselves to be the fools for Christ. You know, we have Indiana here, and I don't know if Fugue's here, but they go to a Byzantine church. Now, the Eastern Church is very, very familiar with the term of the fools for Christ, because the holy men and women of the Eastern churches, you know, think about themselves as being God's fool, God's holy fool. But here we have an integration of intellectuality being born out of the Renaissance, culminating in the 15th century, influenced by the Jesuits, and this little half of a man. John of the Cross was called half a man. Well, actually he wasn't, because what happened was Teresa of Avila, you know, was doing her reform in the Discalced Carmelites. And she went and found two men that could be priests within, you know, the Carmelite order, her new reform. And she said, I found 1.5 men. Now, one of them was Gratian, one of the first, and then it was John. And John was a short man. But the truth is that John was the great man, and Gratian was, you know, just a guy, just a priest. So this little half man, all right, does this incredible synthesis and creates a theology along with the writings of Teresa of Avila. We have a mother and a father, a spiritual mother and a father. And in the beautiful writings of Teresa of Avila, you will see such a woman that encourages, she's nurturing you into spiritual growth. And then we have the father come in and he says, you see that rosary you're so in love with? Give it to me. You're too attached to it. Really? That novena that you like to pray, you hand that over too. I don't want you praying that anymore. A priest did that to me once. You know? He said to me, I want you to only pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet. I said, okay, Father. So I did, out of obedience. You know, the depth of our attachment becomes a real issue. Okay, this is on attachment of the senses. I was reading a part of it before. This signifies, he shall turn to the right hand and shall be hungry, and he shall eat on the left hand and shall not be filled. For they that mortify not their desires when they turn justly, see the fullness of the sweetness of spirit of those who are at the right hand of God, which fullness is not granted to themselves, and justly too. When they eat on the left hand, by which is meant the satisfaction of their desires, with some creature comfort, they are not filled, for leaving aside that which alone can satisfy, they feed on that which causes them greater hunger. It is clear then that the desires weary and fatigue the soul. Okay. All right. I think I'm going to close with this, and I'm going to leave you hungry for John of the Cross, because that is the point of this Utopiana, to encourage you to read the Ascent of Mount Carmel. And I'm going to leave you with this quote. Strive always to prefer not that which is easiest, but that which is most difficult. Not that which is most delectable, but that which is most unpleasing. Not that which gives most pleasure, but rather that which gives least. Not that which is restful, but that which is wearisome. Not that which is consolation, but rather that which is disconsolation. Not that which is greatest, but that which is least. Not that which is loftiest and most precious, but that which is lowest and most despised. Not that which is a desire for anything, but that which is a desire for nothing. Strive to go about seeking not the best of temporal things, but the worst. Strive thus to desire to enter into complete detachment and emptiness and poverty with respect to everything that is in the world for Christ's sake. So there you go. An introduction to the ascent of Mount Carmel. And I hope that you got enough of a taste to realize that the mystical doctor is calling us to be detached from the things of the world. If you want to get closer to God, you've got to learn how to be detached from the things of the world. I encourage you to learn and study and read John of the Cross. As you read him, you'll be inspired to become more and more detached from the world and all of its comforts and its delights and its beauty and its sounds and its touches and its pride and everything else, so that you can be attached to the one who gives all things that are good. This is Thomas the Hermit. Say a prayer for me, I need it, and I am praying for you guys, and everyone have a very, very blessed evening.